Hello everyone, and thanks once again for joining us for Friday's edition of Alaska Weather on the 14th day of October. Up first, we've got on the hazards weather graphic here, winter storm watch out for the Copper River Basin, and that goes into effect Saturday and continues into Saturday morning, and that's for snow and possible freezing rain. Looking anywhere from 1 to 4 inches additional snowfall, and then freezing rain could lay down about as much as a 1/4 inch of glazed ice. That's just a possibility, and this is just a watch, again, for Saturday into Sunday morning through Saturday night. Next up, satellite imagery showing mid and high level clouds kind of came through south central Alaska, dissipating as it pushes northward and breaking out the sunshine over Sitna Valley into Cook Inlet this afternoon, northern Cook Inlet anyway, and then more clouds coming northward with a little bit more moisture from Kodiak Island into Bristol Bay and up along the North Gulf Coast. Pretty light rainfall amounts today, nothing significant anywhere around the state, about the heaviest over the Alaska Peninsula to the Pribilofs. And main low pressure area is out there. And again, mild temperatures over the southern panhandle into the upper 50s at mid-afternoon today. Otherwise pretty chilly up over the central and northern interior, mostly in the teens, and then back into the lower 20s along the Arctic coast with some gusty west winds as high as 30 to 35 miles an hour. And rolling this again, you can see that low spinning there just west of Nikolsky out over the Aleutians, and that'll be moving slowly. That's associated with the frontal boundary there, the main parent low south of the Alaska Peninsula. And then some warm front moisture trying to push into the southern southeast coast. Pretty light up through today, really not much at all, just a few hundredths of an inch down over the southern areas, and then drying out to the north. And then again, variable cloudiness moving up into southern Alaska this afternoon, kind of dissipating the farther north it goes. Pretty much a dry day along the Arctic coast up there, but winds kicking up a little bit with a high center down over the eastern Brooks Range, a little bit lower pressure to the north, and again 30 to 35 mile an hour winds, but rainfall amounts with that front over the Alaska Peninsula there, the heaviest in that area, but not all that heavy. 0.3 of an inch at Cold Bay today. King Cove and St. Paul Island had about 0.2 of an inch, just 3 or 4 hundredths there at Kodiak State Airport and Kodiak Island, a few hundredths of an inch over the southern panhandle, but winds gusting up to 30 to 40 miles an hour over the Alaska Peninsula today, and the Pribilofs, pretty windy conditions there as well along the southwest coast, and north winds gusting up to 30 to 45 miles an hour over the central Aleutians. And for tonight, that low center drifts up through just south of Sand Point area there, with the front pushing northward, so warm front rain will increase over the northern panhandle especially, and the North Gulf Coast, with snow pushing into the Kenai Peninsula and Prince William Sound, as well as the southern and eastern Copper River Basin. Winds start to pick up there over the central interior with that tight gradient, the 1,032 millibar high over the Yukon there, Northwest Territories, and then the lower pressure down south of the Alaska Peninsula. And you can see tighter gradient there will probably support some stronger winds. Winds will stay light and they'll stay dry over the northern interior. And moving on to the forecast for Saturday, periods of snow push northward there, north of the Alaska Range up to Eagle and maybe a little beyond there, with periods of snow or freezing rain over the Copper River Basin. Again, the winter storm warning out for, again, 1 to 4 inches of snow with possible freezing rain in areas there. And then warmer temperatures over the southern panhandle as that rain area lifts northward. Could see some partial clearing, looking for highs 60 to 65 there, Prince of Wales Island over toward Misty Fjords, including Metlakatla, and 50s to the north. Warmer temperatures over the interior as well, southern interior, with Chance of moisture, showers of rain or snow, showers for the Alaska Peninsula. North winds 15 to 30 miles an hour over the Aleutians, maybe some higher gusts, with showers most numerous over the Alaska Peninsula, becoming scattered to widely scattered over the Aleutians. And then for the outlook for Sunday, we've got low pressure now pulls northward into Bristol Bay. South to north flow keeps surges of moisture coming northward. That frontal boundary starting to break up a little bit there. That'll keep the North Gulf Coast wet with possible moderate amounts of rain in localized areas there, southern Kenai Peninsula, western Prince William Sound, Whittier into Portage, likely seeing the heaviest precipitation, lighter amounts in eastern Cook Inlet, and then picking up again over toward the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range. Could be in the form of rain or snow. The warmer temperatures, high should be in the well into the 40s over much of south central Alaska, as well as Prince William Sound. Warmer temperatures the Copper River Basin as well, with that southerly wind flow. Then areas of snow with a trough there over the northeast interior, from the eastern Arctic coast down across the Brooks Range into the Koyukuk, Kobuk valleys. That's light snow in toward Kotzebue, as well as Norton Sound and the lower Yukon River Valley. Otherwise, just scattered rain and snow showers over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta down to the Pribilofs, with some pretty gusty north winds there for St. Lawrence Island. And showers again, scattered showers for the Alaska Peninsula. Eastern Aleutians, maybe a dry day for the central Aleutians. And then moving on to lows for tonight, pretty mild over the southern Panhandle, looking at lows in the mid to upper 50s, mid 40s farther to the north and the eastern North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, warmer night tonight, south central Alaska with increasing clouds, upper 20s to lower 30s, near 10, staying above zero in the Copper River Basin, mid 20s the Susitna Valley, lower 20s in the Kuskokwim Valley, in the 30s elsewhere, except Kodiak about 42. Highs tomorrow in the 30s to near 40s or mid 40s for Homer, near 40 for Seward, 60 to 65 in the southern Panhandle. And for the lows the following morning, looking mid to upper 20s for the Kuskokwim Valley, mid to upper 30s for Bristol Bay, near 50 Kodiak Island, lower 50s for the Panhandle, upper 40s for the North Gulf Coast, followed by highs mid 60s southern southeast coast, near 60 for Sitka, Petersburg, Wrangell, upper 50s Juneau, and mid to upper 40s to lower 50s south central Alaska, Kodiak Island, and Bristol Bay, and 30s to lower 40s for the Kuskokwim Valley. And up to the north, lows tonight either side of zero for the Brooks Range, otherwise mostly in the teens in the central interior and the Arctic coast, mid-20s out toward the Seward Peninsula, followed by highs in the mid to upper 20s in the Yukon, Koyukuk, and Kobuk Valley areas, lower 30s, 30 to 35 for the central interior, and in the 20s for the Arctic coast. And lows on Sunday morning, single numbers for the Brooks Range, teens for the Arctic coast and North Slope, and mostly in the 20s south of the Brooks Range, except 15 to 20 for the Koyukuk and Kobuk Valley areas, as well as Noatak. And highs, upper 20s and near 30 for the Arctic coast, mid-20s North Slope into the Brooks Range, and in the 30s to near 40 there for the Tanana Valley. And out to the southwest, high lows near 30 tonight, mid-30s for the Pribilofs, lower 40s for the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, highs 45 to 50 in the Alaska Peninsula, otherwise in the 40s, mid-30s along the southwest coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Saturday morning starts out pretty good flying weather-wise over interior Alaska from the Arctic coast all the way down toward the North Gulf Coast. Some IFR starting to show up, though, right along the coastline. IFR for the most part in the Panhandle, and mostly VFR for the Aleutians and the Bering Sea. And then for the afternoon, a lot of moisture pushes northward into southern Alaska and makes a pretty good jog up the east side there. IFR north of Eagle by afternoon. Some marginal VFR along the Arctic coast, otherwise IFR holding for the North Slope, Brooks Range, and into the western interior. Another band of IFR with the next system out over the western Aleutians, and marginal for the Panhandle. And for Sunday morning, IFR, Central Arctic Coast, Central North Slope, VFR to the east and along most of the Brooks Range. Marginal VFR with some areas of IFR now spreading northward, almost right across the Kobuk, Koyukuk Valley and the Yukon Flats. Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island staying VFR. And then southern Alaska, a lot of IFR now into the Kuskokwim Valley and south central Alaska. Marginal, though, for the Susitna Valley and Cook Inlet, eastern Kenai Peninsula due to downsloping winds off the mountains. And IFR for the North Gulf Coast, along the coast and northern Panhandle. VFR over toward Misty Fjords, Hyder and Stewart. But a lot of marginal VFR over the Aleutians and much of the Bering Sea, but St. Lawrence Island still VFR, as well as Seward Peninsula and the Noatak Valley. And for Sunday afternoon, band of IFR there across the central interior, just south or along and just south of the Yukon River, and then the lower Yukon River Valley and the Delta, mostly IFR. Same thing for the Kuskokwim Delta down to Togiak Bay across the Alaska Peninsula and Sitkinak Island IFR. Another batch of IFR there for the eastern North Gulf Coast, still northward across central eastern Copper River Basin, Tanana Valley, northward, north of Eagle. Marginal VFR there in the center, south central Alaska, Kodiak Island, Prince William Sound, and Bristol Bay. Passes Saturday, VFR, Anaktuvik and Adigan. And for the western Alaska Range, marginal VFR, Lake Clark, Merrill, and Rainy, marginal. Windy, VFR to marginal VFR. Isabel starting out VFR early and then becoming IFR through the afternoon. And Mintesta, IFR the entire day. Tanita, marginal VFR, trending toward IFR conditions, especially on the eastern entrance in the afternoon. Portage, IFR. Lowest conditions eastern approach there. And for Chilkoot and White, marginal VFR. Freezing levels, quite a gradient there across the Panhandle, running about 6,000 to 12,000 feet as warmer air pushes northward. 2,000 feet in over the southwest interior to the Yukon Delta, central Cook Inlet, 4,000 feet Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula. Icing, areas of considerable moderate rime icing looks pretty good for Prince William Sound, the North Gulf Coast, Coast Range, maybe into the southern Copper River Basin to a certain extent, cutting off about Yakutat, Panhandle, mostly icing free. Areas of isolated moderate icing, mostly light though, scattered areas, Cook Inlet and Bristol Bay, Alaska Peninsula, and the east central Aleutians. And for the jet stream, big trough at 33,000 feet out over the Bering Sea. They're extending south of the Alaska Peninsula. And west-northwesterlies, or westerlies more or less 95 knots across the central western Aleutians. Main jet, though, coming up over the top of that big ridge of high pressure over Vancouver Island, British Columbia. 140 knots, diminished to about 150 knots, and turned a little more southwesterly over the eastern interior. 9,000 feet. Good south to north flow there into the eastern North Gulf Coast, Copper River Basin up to 70 knots. About 40 knots out of the east there for the Koyukuk-Kobuk Valley out to St. Lawrence Island, and northwest 40 over the central Aleutian areas. And looking at 3,000 feet, again, south to north flow coming right up to the eastern North Gulf Coast, north coast of the Panhandle, about 45 knots. And southeast 35 knots over northern Bristol Bay, east 45 knots there. Kobuk Valley out across the Seward Peninsula. And then northerlies about 30 to 40 knots over the central Aleutians. Turbulence-wise, considerable moderate chop there along the Yukon River, Kobuk, Koyukuk Valley, Seward Peninsula, and the Lotto Hills. Eastern Aleutians, Atka Island, and the Panhandle looking pretty bumpy for the day tomorrow. After the break, I'll be back with a marine forecast.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse. We're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles and nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected and the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and we'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And the coastal water forecast. Starting out, south coast of the Panhandle, southerly winds on Saturday, 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for the north coast, south to southeast winds 35 knots, seas around 16 feet. Lynn Canal, north winds 15 knots with higher gusts, and Stevens Passage, south winds 20 knots. Clarence Strait, small craft advisory, southeast winds 25 knots. And for the day Sunday, small craft advisories for all of the coast. South winds 25 knots, 9 to 11 foot seas. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, northern inner channel, southeast winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. Stevens Passage, south winds at 20 with 4 foot seas, and small craft advisories for Clarence Strait for 25 knot winds with 5 foot seas with the winds from the south. Prince William Sound on Saturday, northeast winds 20 knots, seas 3 feet. Eastern North Gulf Coast, Middleton Island, east winds 30 knots, seas 11 feet. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast, northeast winds 35 knots, seas up to 15 feet, and gale warnings for Barren Islands, east winds 35 knots. Also gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, northeast winds at 35 knots. Cook Inlet, small craft advisories, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for Sunday, Cook Inlet, lighter winds, northeast 15 to 20 knots, seas 3 to 5 feet, and southeast 25 for Kamishak Bay. And Prince William Sound, southeast winds 25 knots. North Gulf Coast, same thing, southeast winds 25 knots. And the Barren Islands, winds will be southerly at 25 knots with 9 foot seas. And for Shelikof Strait, gale warnings, northeast winds 40 knots for Saturday, seas 13 feet. Otherwise, south at 20 knots for the east side of Kodiak Island. Alaska Peninsula, small craft advisories, north to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, seas around 10 feet. And for Bristol Bay, northeast winds 35 knots. Sunday, Alaska Peninsula, west winds 20 knots. Kodiak Island, south to southeast winds 15 to 25 knots. And for Bristol Bay, winds will be south at 25 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, north to northwest winds on Saturday, 20 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for the central Aleutians, northwest winds 35 knots. And for the western Aleutians, northwest winds at 25 knots. And for Sunday, western Aleutians, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, and small craft advisories for the central Aleutians, west-northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, Fox Islands, northwest winds 20 to 30 knots with 7 to 9 foot seas. For the southwest coast, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots with 8 foot seas, and small craft advisories for the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island, as well as St. Lawrence Island. All 25 knot, all three areas there will see 25 knot winds out of the northeast with 9 foot seas. And for Sunday, Pribilof Islands, northwest winds 25 knots. St. Matthew Island, north winds 30 knots. St. Lawrence Island, gale warnings, north winds 35 knots. For the southwest coast, north winds 20 to 25 knots. Up along the Arctic coast, eastern Beaufort Sea coast, south to southeast winds 15 knots tomorrow. Southwest 15 knot winds for the central and western coast. And from Wales to Cape Lisburne, east winds 15 knots. Big increase in the winds on Sunday up there. Good gales for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. East winds 40 knots with seas at 9 feet. Central Arctic coast, east winds 30 knots, and the western side 30 to 40 knot winds out of the northeast. Southeast Chukchi Sea, north winds at 30 knots. And for tonight, look for rain to increase. Kodiak Island, North Gulf Coast, and the northern Panhandle, with rain tapering off later tonight over the southern southeast coast as that warm front slowly lifts northward. Snow pushing into the southern and southeast Copper River Basin, where there's a winter storm watch out for snow and freezing rain that stays out through, into Saturday and Sunday. And then for the interior there, eastern interior, tightening gradient, increasing winds. And for tomorrow, snow pushing northward to the Yukon River there, a little ways north of Eagle, southward into the Copper River Basin, becomes mixed precipitation there. Rain along the North Gulf Coast and northern Panhandle, drying out with warmer temperatures, pushing back up towards 60 again for the southern southeast coast. And then the outlook for Sunday, a front keeps the North Gulf Coast wet, mild temperatures with cloudy skies and some moisture for southern Alaska, and snow over the north interior.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.